This meeting is being recorded.
It is indeed. Have you accepted the recording?
Yes, I said continue.
Fabulous. So, thank you, Nina, for pre recording our Young at Heart autism talk for those of us who cannot make it on the day of your talk, which is, what's the date of it again? It's going to be
The 17th, I believe.
on the 17th of June 2021. So, for anybody that can't see Nina's autism talk, she is pre recording it for you all to feast your eyes upon. So, thank you, Nina, for that. And yes, go for it.
All right, welcome everyone. This is Autism 101, all the things you didn't know about autism. Let's get started. So first of all, we have to say what autism is, helpful. It's a neurological condition which is present from birth, which appears to be genetic. So you've got it in your brain and you're born with it, basically. It's a type of brain which is different from the medical norm, and that means it's not neurotypical and not holistic. So if you're neurotypical, then you have a medically normal brain. So if you're, for example, dyslexic, or if you have schizophrenia or anything like that, then you're not neurotypical. But allistic is different. Allistic just means not autistic. So if you are neuroatypical, if you have, for example, schizophrenia, but you're not autistic, then you're still allistic. And it's important that we know these words, because if people don't know these words, then they just use the word normal. Like, oh, I'm not autistic, I'm normal. Or I'm not schizophrenic, I'm normal. And that implies that everyone with these conditions is abnormal, which is not very flattering. And it also sets you up as the default, which means that you get treated in a privileged way. So it's important that we know these vocabulary. Autism comes from the word auto, which is Greek for self, and it comes from this idea that we're kind of wrapped up in our own minds. I find it a little unflattering, but it's the only word we've got, so never mind. It's a spectrum, but this does not mean that everybody has it. I'll go on to discuss the spectrum in more detail in a later slide. When it comes to how autism affects us, I usually split the effects into sensory, executive function, and social categories, but there are others. We'd be here all day if we went through every effect of autism. I just split them into the ones that I consider to be most important, and I'll go through them in the later slides. So what is autism not? We have to have a whole slide on what autism is not, because there are so many myths and misconceptions out there. Autism is not considered a mental illness. It's not psychological, it's neurological. So it's not like depression. You can't really be born with depression, though you can be born with a predisposition to depression, but you are born with autism. It's not a disease, it's a condition, but it's not a disease, and it's not an epidemic either. Sometimes when people want to scaremonger about autism, they say, oh, it's an epidemic, more and more kids are being diagnosed, it's an epidemic. It's not an epidemic because it's not a disease. And the only reason more people are being diagnosed is because we know more about it. It's not caused by vaccines, but it shouldn't really matter anyway, because vaccines keep us safe, and I'd rather be here and safe than unvaccinated and dead. Um, some of us do take issue with the word disorder. A lot of people nowadays, for some reason, have started saying autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and they seem to think that this is the polite way of referring to it, but it's not. A lot of us really don't like the word disorder being used. I don't feel disordered personally. Um, it's not just for children, it's not just for boys and men, it's not just for white people, and it's not just for middle class people. If you fall out of any of those categories, if you're a girl, if you're not middle class, if you're not white, then you'll have real problems getting a diagnosis, because doctors still have a really stereotypical idea of what an autistic person looks like. But it's just not true. There's autistic people in every demographic. It's not curable. You'll find people trying to sell cures for autism. Those people are all quacks. Don't listen to them. It's not curable any more than someone's sexuality is curable. It's all to do with how your brain is wired, and you just can't rewire someone's brain like that. It does not mean we lack compassion. You see this all the time. Oh, they have no empathy. They have no empathy. It's not true at all. An autistic person can and does have empathy. We're not what they call psychopaths. We do have compassion. And finally, it's not separate from who we are as people. There is no real Nina who exists behind my autism, because I'm already here and I'm already real. You do sometimes get parents saying, oh, I know my little Johnny is in there just behind his autism, but that's them refusing to accept their child for who they are, and they're only going to break their own hearts by doing that, because their kid is already there in front of them. So the autism spectrum. This is from a magazine, an online magazine by Rebecca Burgess, and I find it very useful to visualize the spectrum in this way. Sometimes when people think of the spectrum, they think of the autism spectrum as being just a line with not autistic on one end and very autistic on the other. But this is far too simplistic to really understand what the spectrum looks like. The spectrum is more like the image on the right, which is like a color wheel, which has loads of categories like language, motor skills, perception, executive function, and sensory filter around it. And each dot can be anywhere on that line. So, for example, an autistic person might be incredibly good with language but have really poor executive function, or they might have really good perception but really shockingly poor motor skills. That's a far more useful way to describe the spectrum because it shows all the infinite possibilities that we've got here, and it also shows that some of them can actually be quite useful as well as more negative traits. High functioning, low functioning. Why are functioning labels controversial? People love to try and put us in boxes and try and say, oh, that's a low functioning autistic or that's a high functioning autistic. But it can be problematic in several ways. High functioning can imply that we don't need support, which is not always true. Even those of us like me who have jobs and stuff, we still need support. And low functioning, meanwhile, can imply that we can't do anything, that we're just useless at everything. It's not very helpful to apply functioning labels to us because our functioning labels level change all the time, depending on energy levels, environment, and what task we're doing. If you really want to say if you really want to describe our abilities, then you can use more specific labels. Like for instance, you can say that somebody's non-speaking if they can't speak. That's at least a useful specific term because it's not just applying to the everything the person does. So if you need to use a functioning label, then just be specific about it and don't just write someone off as low functioning. So here are some symbols of our community, and you can see there's a big divide here. We've got symbols designed by autistic people on the left, and on the right we've got symbols designed by neurotypical people. So I'll go through them neurotypical design first. On the side designed by neurotypicals, you'll see that there's a lot of blue. This is partly due to Autism Speaks, which is an American group which is not run by autistic people. It's run by neurotypical people, and it's very controversial with us. We don't like Autism Speaks on the whole because they promote therapies which harm us, which I'll talk about later. But they use a lot of blue, partly because it's considered a boys' condition. So there's loads of wee white young boys with a blue background and in stereotypical material designed by neurotypicals. They all seem to look sad and despondent. They're always isolated and alone. You can also see a lot of puzzle pieces. This is because the autistic community has been symbolized by a puzzle piece since 1970, when the National Autistic Society in Britain designed this puzzle piece graphic for autistic people. And the National Autistic Society is not run by us. It's not run by autistic people. It's run by neurotypicals. And the reason they chose the puzzle piece is because of this idea that we have a piece missing, that we are autistic because there's something wrong with us, that there's something missing there and we need an extra piece. And this is just not true. And it's why a lot of us really don't like the puzzle piece being used as a symbol for autism. But neurotypicals keep using it anyway because they don't always listen to what we have to say about things. And you can see also how medicalized autism is. You've got a connection between autism and glyphosate, basically trying to find out what causes autism so they can stop it. It's really quite offensive to us when people try and do studies on what causes autism, because the next thing they study is how do we make it stop. And we prefer existing to being eradicated on the whole. Also, on the image of the baby, you've got a heart monitor behind him. And this is particularly stupid because autism doesn't affect your heart rate. It's just another aspect of how medicalized autism is. It's really seen as a disease by neurotypicals, even though it's not. Meanwhile, on the autistic design side, we've suddenly got loads of color. Rainbows are really popular with the autistic community because of the spectrum, the color spectrum. And it symbolizes the infinite variety of ways in which autism can manifest itself. That's why the infinity symbol is really common as well, because there's just infinite ways in which we can be autistic, and there's no right or wrong way to be autistic. So you'll see a lot of those. We've suddenly got happy people, we've got girls, we've got Black people represented on the autistic design side. Suddenly it's not a monoculture anymore. and they are stimming. So you can see that they're flapping their hands, and that's something that we sometimes stereotypically do that I'll explain later. But it's nice that they're being shown happy and that they're being shown stimming, because quite often stimming is seen as a problem, and I'll go on to talk about stimming later. Um, Instead of blue, we've got red instead. That's a campaign by us, by autistic people, against all this blue on the other side, because red is a gender neutral color, and it's also the opposite of blue on the color spectrum. So red instead is being set up to kind of dismiss the blue dominated neurotypical side. We've also got light it up gold, because AU, the letters AU on the periodic table stand for gold. So we've got, and AU is what autism begins with. So we've got light it up gold as well as an alternative to red instead. And finally, we've got autism acceptance as a human right. This is important because the neurotypicals tend to say autism awareness. They use the word awareness, like be aware of autism. But awareness isn't enough, because you can be aware of something and hate it. You can be aware of a person and hate them. But whereas accepting people is better. So we prefer autism acceptance. And we don't see this as just an added bonus. We see it as a human right. We see it as essential that we're accepted, not just made aware. So, do you consider yourself disabled? I sometimes get asked this question, and the last time I was asked this question, it was by a lady who was like, "Oh, but you can't possibly consider yourself disabled, right?" But I personally do consider myself disabled nowadays, and I'll go on to explain why. It's because of the social model of disability. Now, what this means is, I want you to imagine for a second that you're being transported into a parallel universe. And in this parallel universe, it's exactly like it is now, except for one big difference. Uh, Everyone except you knows how to fly. So a person could just flap their arms and fly to a different level of the building or into the air. And in this parallel universe, there are no stairs because nobody else needs them. We just fly between floors. If you were transported into that magical parallel universe, then you would be a disabled person, even if you're not a disabled person in this world. In this mythical world, you would be disabled because you suddenly would not be in a society which is catering to your needs. You would have special needs because you would need stairs or a lift to get from floor to floor. That's what the social model of disability means. It means that it's society that disables us by not catering to our needs. Um, Disability is quite a controversial issue in the autistic community, partly due to social stigma. So, like, I consider myself disabled now because I'm autistic and society does not cater to autistic people's needs. But I didn't always consider myself disabled because it's so uncool to be disabled. When I was a kid, I was quite superficial and I was like, I don't want to be uncool. I want to be one of the cool kids, so I can't be a disabled person. And I got really upset when my primary school described me as disabled on a form. But that was superficial. And looking back at it now, I'm quite ashamed of that because I had disabled friends at the time. And I was thinking, how can I possibly be a good friend to these disabled friends if I'm so offended at being called disabled, as if it's such a bad thing? So now I'm not offended at all at being called disabled. And I'm proud to be a member of the disabled community. So, sensory issues, we're on to how autism affects us. Many of us have a weakened sensory filter, meaning that some sensory input can be overwhelming. I always found at school that the school bell, the bell that rang between each classes, was deafening, and I found that quite painful. A lot of us find strong smells and other such things hard to deal with. One of my primary sensory issues is auditory processing. I can't have conversations in places with lots of background noise because I can't understand what's being said to me. Auditory processing is not like being deaf. It's more like how your brain reacts to what's going on, what's going into your ears. So I have very good hearing, but if there's loads of noises at once, I find it hard to tell them apart. So that's why I find conversations in crowded places to be very difficult, even though my hearing is excellent. Many of us are also sensory seeking, which means that we require and seek out sensory input in order to release nervous energy. This is called stimming and it's highly stigmatized, but neurotypicals and people with ADHD do it too. So, stimming is just self stimulating behavior, like, for example, hand flapping or clicking your pen or using a stim toy like a fidget spinner. Um, it's very stigmatized. A lot of people hate it. Rocking back and forward is another type of stimming that we do. And people find it very disturbing to watch because they think, oh, a neurotypical person would never do that unless they were in distress. But actually, we autistic people can do it when we're happy. Um, and it's very stigmatized, but it's a really healthy and good thing that we do and should be, if anything, should be encouraged. So here's the activity that we can do. It's called sensory painting, but you can use pencils or markers as well. It doesn't have to be paint. Um, and it's an activity I designed myself. And the idea is that you take any sense that's not sight. So take sound, texture, smell, or taste, and take any object, any household object that you might have near you, and paint how that object smells, or how it tastes, or how it feels, or how it sounds. So, for example, if you've got some dark chocolate there with you, take a smell of it, take a taste of it, and then paint what colors and images come into your mind. It's very experimental. There's no wrong or right way of doing it. But that's the activity that we're going to be doing. And now we can just skip past it because this is a recording. What's a meltdown? Not a tantrum. So meltdowns are something that we experience when we're extremely stressed, like if we have sensory overload or if we're in a really stressful situation. It's an uncontrollable medical event like a panic attack or an asthma attack. And it happens when we're under extreme stress, often but not always due to sensory bombardment. And it can be distressing to witness, but is always more distressing for us to go through. So a meltdown can often manifest itself in screaming and crying, which is how I experienced my meltdown that I had in Orlando Airport in Florida. Basically, there was construction work happening inside the airport, which was making huge noise. And then I had to get my passport read by a machine, and the machine refused to read my passport, and I melted down. So I was basically hysterically crying and screaming and just saying, it hurts over and over again. And anyone seeing this would probably think, oh, that's a low functioning autistic. They shouldn't be allowed outside without a minder. But I'm mostly high functioning. It's just that situation that put me into a meltdown. And so it can happen to anybody, any autistic person. And it's really, really distressing. So if somebody's melting down, like treat them with compassion. Don't yell at them or tell them to just get up because it's an uncontrollable medical event and you just need to write it out. Executive function is a way in which autism affects us. Executive function is here defined as a set of processes that all have to do with managing oneself and one's resources in order to achieve a goal. So that's all big and scary words, but all it means is things that our brain does. Life tasks of all types involve executive function because they all involve organization, planning, and multiple steps. Time management is one facet of executive function. So anything, including making a cake or making a cup of tea, involves executive function because you plan the steps and you do the steps in order. My own potential issues with executive function include floundering when structures are not specific and clear enough. If I'm given a task at work and the instructions are not clear, then I can't do the task. And I don't think that's unique to me. I think that most people would struggle in that situation. But I really need very clear instructions because if there's a way of misinterpreting them, I'll misinterpret them, not on purpose, but just because it's how my brain works. I'm very literal minded as well, which is a really common thing for autistic people. Social interaction. So this is one of the defining features of autism is our unique approach to social interaction. Most people wouldn't say unique, most people would say disordered, but I don't think our approach is disordered at all. I think that our approach is simply autistic. Um, we usually use talking for relaying information. So we don't normally do much small talk. We just use talking as a tool for giving someone information. So I'm talking right now because I'm giving you information, not because I enjoy it or for the good of my health. Some of us, though, info dump about our interests. So if we often have really specific, special interests, we really passionate interests. It's stereotypical that we're all into trains. I'm not into trains. I'm more into cats. But we quite often have really strong interests that we love to dump information on people about, and we do this because we're trying to share our joy with you. People sometimes act as if, oh, we're being unkind by dumping all this info on them, but we're not trying to be unkind. We're just trying to share joy. If we're not looking at you or fidgeting, it doesn't mean we don't care or we're not paying attention. We actually pay more attention if we aren't looking at you, because then we don't have to focus on looking at you. If we have to focus on looking you in the eye or focus on not fidgeting, then that's energy we could be using to listen to you. A night out may not be necessarily our idea of a good time, but don't be afraid to invite us anyway. My rule of thumb is include but don't force. So always give us the option to join in on your work nights out or whatever. But if we say no, then just leave it alone. Don't be like Mrs. Doyle and Father Ted, like, oh, go on, go on, go on. Don't do that. Just leave it alone. Include but don't force. Appropriate language. People are really, really scared of saying the wrong thing. So here's some examples of different ways of referring to autistic people. We've got person first language, which means a person with autism, but we've also got identity first language, which is an autistic person. Um, and most neurotypicals will use person first language, but we autistic people, we use identity first, and we tend to prefer identity first language. And there's a reason for this. Autistic is not a dirty word, and it must be destigmatized. If people really go out of their way to avoid using the word autistic, then what does that do? It stigmatizes the word. It attaches shame to the word. We need people to use the word autistic in order to not have it not be stigmatized. Because if people don't use the word autistic, then the only people who will still be using it are the people who use it as an insult. And I don't want them to have the word. I want us to have it. So please do use the word autistic. Autistic is not a dirty word. So autism is part of our identity. Similarly, nobody would ever say a man with blackness or a woman with lesbianism. At least I've never heard anyone say that. And people try and get smart. They try and go, oh, but you'd never say a cancerous person. You'd say a person with cancer. But that goes back to what I was saying before about autism being not a disease. Autism's not a disease, and cancer is. Most people don't consider cancer to be a fundamental part of who they are, but autism is a fundamental part of who we are. Um, so don't avoid saying the word autistic. Basically, say the word autistic. It really does help us. Some people say Asperger's syndrome, which is what I was initially diagnosed with, and that has gone way out of fashion. It's no longer in the DSM. It's no longer in the diagnostic manual. And one of the reasons for this is because it's just all autism. Asperger's syndrome was supposed to be like high functioning autism, but now that functioning labels are kind of out the window, so is Asperger's syndrome. But more importantly, Hans Asperger himself was a Nazi, and we don't want to honor him by giving his name to a condition. So that nowadays the word Asperger's syndrome is falling out of use, and in the autistic community, not many people use it anymore. What's ableism and how do I avoid being ableist? So, ableism is discrimination and prejudice against disabled people. It can be conscious or unconscious, overt or subtle, and it's deeply entrenched in our society. Seriously, ableism is everywhere. Every time there's a building that it doesn't have a wheelchair ramp, every time there's a restaurant that doesn't have a braille menu, that's ableism. And it's not conscious ableism. It's not people going, oh, how do we keep the disabled out of here? It's just how society is structured. And it's even though it's not on purpose, it's still harmful. So if you want to avoid being ableist, listen to autistic people and disabled people and act on what we say. We've got a saying in the disabled community, nothing about us without us is for us. So if you're worried about being ableist, just consult us. We're happy to be consulted because it means you care about what we say. Don't insist on eye contact. Autistic people often find eye contact to be distressing or difficult. I personally find it okay, but I'm not every autistic person. Don't insist that someone looks you in the eye, especially if you're trying to figure out if they're lying. Because I remember my dad used to ask me, look me in the eye and tell me that when he wanted to find out if I was lying. And I found it really painful and hard, even if I wasn't lying. So don't insist on eye contact. Um, if you want to avoid being ableist, also seek out our voices. Just look at the actually autistic hashtag on Twitter, Tumblr, and elsewhere, and it'll help you find out what our community is saying. Actually autistic is a really good hashtag because it's the hashtag that's used by us. If you just use hashtag autism, you've got a post by everybody, but actually autistic is what we are saying. And just ask us if you're uncertain. We're happy to receive questions for the most part because it means that you care. Hello, Wobbles. My cat just joined us. It means that you care about what we say. Accommodations at work and school may help autistic people and everyone else. So having an alternative space to work when the normal workspace becomes too noisy and warm can be really useful. I had a separate space in school sometimes to do my work. That really helped. So it was just me in the room. Being allowed to use things like headphones, stress balls, and so on in the workplace or in school, whilst not distracting others, these can really help. I used my headphones to do my art at school so that I didn't get distracted by the noises in the art room. Ensure instructions are clear and provide them in writing so they can be reread. I think that's self-explanatory. And let us skip PE and do our homework at school. There's no autistic person in the world, in my opinion, who enjoys PE because our motor skills tend to be bad. And none of us enjoy doing homework at home because that's our space to relax. So let us do our homework at school instead, and don't be cruel. So what issues do we face today? Sometimes I get people saying, "Oh, it must be all right now because you've got hate crime legislation, so there can't possibly be anything wrong with how you're treated today." But we still face social isolation and bullying. I don't know a single autistic person that wasn't bullied at school. We suffer lack of accommodation in education and at work. If we're asking for a separate room or something, or even to just be allowed to use stress balls, then people sometimes say no, even though it doesn't cost them anything. There's stigma, there's this perception that we're dangerous or a criminal. That one comes up every time there's a school shooting in America. There's always somebody saying, "Oh, I bet he was autistic." This is because we're often bullied, and there's this perception that the victims of bullying go and shoot up schools. But it's a really dangerous stigma because we're already in a vulnerable position because we're so likely to be bullied. So that stigma is really dangerous for us. We're actually more likely to be a victim of crime than the perpetrator. We've got increased likelihood of being a victim of crime. That includes sexual crimes and domestic violence. We've got infantilization. People treat us like children, even though we're not. And we've got unemployment, underemployment, and exploitation by employers. So this is not the whole list. There's other stuff as well, like medical discrimination. We're less likely to receive transplants, even though we've been on the waiting list longer, because our quality of life is considered poorer. So we do face a lot of discrimination even today. So here are some useful organizations potentially. These are all run by autistic people. So we've got Amaze, which is the Autistic Mutual Aid Society Edinburgh, very local to Edinburgh. They have a great website with a useful glossary of terms that you should really check out. There's SWAN, which is the Scottish Women's Autism Network. They're important because autism is seen as a men's condition, so it's good that these groups exist. We've got AWN, which is the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, so for everyone who's not a man, basically. And then we've got R, which is the Autistic Rights Group Highland, whose acronym I love. Those are all local to Scotland, but if you want a global organisation, then there's ASAN, which is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. All these groups are run by us, by autistic people. You'll notice that the National Autistic Society and Scottish Autism are not on here, and that's because they're not run by us. So I would never use them. I'd never use their resources. I'd never use them for training or anything. Just use orgs that are run by us, and it'll be much better. So finally, we are opening the floor to questions, except there are no questions because nobody's actually here. Anna, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask?
Yes, can you stop sharing your screen and then we'll see both of us and I'll ask you a question.
Yes, one second. New share. No, I don't want to new share. I want to stop.
Just
Oh,
stop
there we go.
sharing. Yeah,
Stop share.
that's it. So, yes, I have a question. Because I just come out of a university course that was talking all about inclusion and including things like autism and other things like different mental health issues people face and things like that. And we were talking a lot about the person first, person centered kind of way of talking. And my understanding was the most recent name for autism is, instead of ASD, which is autistic spectrum disorder, they've changed it apparently to autistic spectrum condition. And I was wondering
Okay.
how you feel about the word condition rather than disorder, or just don't use it at all.
I feel much more positively about the word condition because it's a neutral word. You can have a good condition or a bad condition, where there's no such thing as a good disorder. So yeah, autistic spectrum condition is fine. I would just say autism as well. Like I don't really care if people put the spectrum in because we all know it's a spectrum anyway. But yeah, if they want to use the word condition, I'm absolutely fine with that. To answer your question.
Thank you. And I think we covered this in the last video, but just for anybody that hasn't seen it, can you remind me what age you were when you were diagnosed? And I believe it got diagnosed a bit later than you were planning. Is that right? Because it's typically males that get diagnosed first. Is that right?
Yes, I was 10 when I got diagnosed, and that was eight years after my mum knew I was autistic. My mum had worked for an autism charity before I was born and knew what autism was, and she noticed when I was 2 that I was obviously quite autistic. Quite, I mean, very autistic. I am autistic, but she noticed that it was pretty obvious to her when I was 2. But every doctor she took me to laughed in her face because I was a girl. That child is not autistic, that child's not autistic, and so on and so on. And this went on for 8 years. So I could have been diagnosed as early as 2 if people had listened to my mother, who knew what she was talking about. but instead I had to wait till I was 10. So that meant that in primary school I had no support until primary 6. So I had primary 1 till 5, 1 till 6, all without any kind of understanding or support. And so teachers were quite horrible to me because they didn't understand why I didn't want to do my homework at home, and they didn't understand why I couldn't physically do PE. So yeah, it was a lot of years that was ultimately, I don't want to say wasted, but it was it
Not
was
with
it was
support. Yeah.
yeah, it was a lot of years without support that should have been there. So
Mm.
yeah, and it was all because of this perception that I'm not what an autistic person normally looks like. I'm too girly to be autistic. Um,
You think that's because girls are typically, like stereotypically, better at hiding their autism in some ways, or why do you
we
think
do
that is?
we do seem to be better at hiding our autism for reasons unknown, probably because we're under a lot of social pressure to fit in anyway. And yeah, people do just tend to be quite dismissive of us. We also tend to be quieter,
Mm,
so people just leave us to get on with it. But yeah, no, it's all very mysterious, and it's complicated by the fact that a lot of us are quite, I don't want to say gender confused, that sounds horrible. I mean,
mm,
I'm including myself in that. A lot of us are quote unquote gender confused. A lot of us are trans, a lot of us are non-binary, a lot of us really don't fit in traditional gender roles at all. um so that complicates matters even more.
mhm. Yeah. Thank you, Nina. I think this is going to be a really educational video for anybody that's watching, and even better for those of us who are going to be together on the 17th of June and doing the activity with you. So thanks for recording it so people can watch it if they're not able to be there. We'll probably post
Anytime.
this. We'll post this after the event, so obviously nobody's just skiving because we want other people to come. But yes, it'll be really nice for people to be able to watch it who haven't been able to attend. So thanks very
Awesome.
much.
Thanks, Anna.